Howdy my totally as always tubular gamers, and we're back with, you guessed it, another ranking video, and today's is going to be on a series I hold pretty dear to my heart. We're going to be looking at the Twisted Metal series of games. Now, if you don't know Twisted Metal, you've forgotten about the series. It's a series of vehicular combat games put out by Sony. It originally started on the PS1. It was like a launch title. It was on the PS2, the PSP, and then they had a game on the PS3 and kind of disappeared. These games were all about demolition derby with ballistic weapons such as machine guns, other projectiles, mines, and just a bunch of weapons. You basically were just dropped into an environment and told to destroy each other. Each game really had a similar setup where it takes place around the eponymous Twisted Metal vehicular combat tournament hosted once a year. In almost every game, the host is a man named Calypso, and he basically says whoever wins Twisted Metal, whoever kills everyone in the arenas, will get a wish, and that wish will be whatever they want. But usually the game has a be careful what you wish for kind of theme in it, with some dark humor. These games are all pretty violent. I mean, a series about everyone killing each other in their cars probably isn't going to be the friendliest environment, but yeah, these games are pretty dark, especially the later games where they got very mature very quickly, and over the years, a number of Twisted Metal games did release, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, where Twisted Metal, it still had some decent popularity. Unfortunately, nowadays, Twisted Metal really has become a dormant series. It really has become the poster child for series that are dormant by PlayStation that they just kind of have ignored for years now. It's been over 10 years since we got the last Twisted Metal game. They're working on a show for some reason, so there'll be a show coming one day, but yeah. Twisted Metal, series of vehicular combat games. People love these games for their high-octane action, their challenge, their dark themes, their dark humor, and they're generally superb multiplayer experiences. I've been playing these games for many years. When I was much younger, I fell in love with the series. I remember I had to play all of them, and here we are all these years later. I still love them, and I still think it's the best series of vehicular combat games. So we're going to have the task of ranking them all worst to best. We're going to just kind of be judging them based off everything and my personal feelings. Let me know your list down below, whether you agree or disagree. Hopefully this list is outdated one day and we get another Twisted Metal. I would love to see another Twisted Metal, please. But for now, this is all we got, so let's just get started. Like, share, sub, comment, all that good stuff. What do I think is the weakest Twisted Metal? What's the worst game? I think just about everybody can agree that the worst of the Twisted Metal games is Twisted Metal Small Brawl, released on the PS1 in 2001. Now, Small Brawl is interesting because it is a PS1 kid-friendly Twisted Metal game, and it had come out well after Twisted Metal Black, you know, the darkest game in the whole series, had released on PS2. I guess this was aimed at kids who hadn't upgraded to the PS2 and still were playing on their PS1. In production, it was even called Twisted Metal for Kids, and it definitely shows with this game's atmosphere, its vibes, its characters, and just the general gameplay. Instead of, you know, people being in their cars and killing each other, now it's our Twisted Metal characters as kids playing on the playground and in the backyard, and they're playing with toys, and the toys are destroying each other. And you know, it's not an awful premise, not by any means. It actually does work, and I guess if they really were aiming for that younger audience, then this would be the way to do it. Unfortunately, despite that, I think the game doesn't really do anything all that interesting, memorable, or different from the other Twisted Metal games. It plays much more like Twisted Metal 2 than any of the other PS1 Twisted Metal games, and it feels actually quite watered down from just about every other Twisted Metal game. You're still dropped into these rather large environments and still tasked with destroying the opposition. It just doesn't feel anywhere near as fun though in this game. Maybe it's a scenario been there, done that way too many times on the PS1, or Twisted Metal Black was already out and really blowing people away, but this game just does not really come together all that well to make for a very satisfying experience. Unsurprisingly, the cars don't really have a lot of weight. They don't control all that amazing. Not that, you know, they controlled amazing in the other PS1 games, but they really don't control great here. And then the difficulty is much lower, which might be better depending on who you ask, but the game's vibes, atmosphere, and general feel just isn't there. It doesn't feel like a Twisted Metal game. Even 3 and 4, which arguably didn't feel much like a Twisted Metal game, had some semblance. This just feels like a completely different series. It's incredibly slow-paced, and it just doesn't do anything new to the formula, and it honestly plays worse than the old games. I'm sure this game has some fans, people who were kids and played it back when it came out, and you know, fair enough, but for me personally, it's just always been the worst game in the series. I've never liked this game, no matter how many times I've come back to it. I really do think it is the worst, and I don't think anybody should check it out. Alright, and so here we got Twisted Metal 3, developed not by the original Twisted Metal 1 and 2 team, but 989 Studios, and put out on the PS1 in 1998. Now, over the years, Twisted Metal 3 has garnered a very mixed response, and, you know, coming back all these years later, it's okay at best. I myself have also been very mixed on it, and I feel like every time I come back to this game, I pretty much have a different feeling. Sometimes I say, hey, it's pretty fun, this is pretty solid, this is a good PS1 car combat game. Other times I'm just like, wow, this is bad. Is this even really any better than Small Brawl? At least when it comes to this game's plot, it doesn't stray too far away from the old games. It's about Calypso running Twisted Metal. Whoever wins gets a wish. Unfortunately, I think aside from that, the story is pretty bad. The character motivations are pretty bad, and their individual stories are just kind of stupid. Like, it doesn't line up with the first two games. It's nowhere near as dark or sinister, and I just didn't think it was funny or good. It was just stupid. The motivations are just stupid, and I think that this is some of the worst story and characters that the series has ever seen. But aside from that, the gameplay isn't too far off from the first two games. Presentation-wise, it looks a little better than the first two games. It definitely has a different art style going on here. But when it comes to actually playing it, yeah, it's what you know and expect from Twisted Metal. You're dropped into these rather large environments, much larger than the other games, and you're tasked with destroying all your opponents. You find weapons along the map, you have some machine guns, some turbo, and yeah, you just kill each other. And yeah, like the other games, you go through a championship mode, you go around the world, you go to different locations, large locations I might add, and just go on and kill each other. You fight some bosses along the way, and then you get to the end and you do it as another character. It's not all that far off from, say, a fighting game, and I think it is for the most part a pretty enjoyable time here. The physics are different from Twisted Metal 1 and 2, and it is quite noticeable here. It's slower, your car does roll over, which is annoying. But the game still is decent handling. The sense of speed, it's not as great as the other games, but it's still there, and you know, you're still blowing up the opponents. The actual core gameplay really isn't all that different. The game is nowhere near as hard as the first two games, which might be a good thing. You could still crank that difficulty up. The soundtrack and music is totally different than the other games. They had Rob Zombie, yes, Rob Zombie come in to do the music, and a couple other bands, and you know, I think the music's pretty great in this game. That's a definite highlight. And the game still is some pretty fun multiplayer. The frame rate isn't amazing for it, but what do you really expect? I think Twisted Metal 3 can be a really fun time sometimes, and other times I just feel like it gets so annoying with its slower pace, large areas, and the cars flipping over, but that's why I feel really mixed about it. I think just about everybody can agree, though, that the story and the character motivations are pretty bad in this game. Should you play Twisted Metal 3, if you really like the old Twisted Metal games, go ahead and try it, but otherwise you could totally skip it. And so here is Twisted Metal 4, also developed by 989 Studios, released for the PS1 in 1999. This is also pretty mixed with the Twisted Metal community. The story is actually different. Instead of Calypso running Twisted Metal, it's Sweet Tooth who runs Twisted Metal. And you know, the setup is different, it's interesting, but unfortunately it doesn't really go past that. I just thought that the characters, the motivations, and the endings were all pretty dull. There wasn't really anything all that memorable. It was just kind of stupid. Rob Zombie's a character here, which is pretty funny, and I like that. But other than that, I just didn't really like the game's tone or atmosphere or characters. It was actually very different from the other ones, even different from Twisted Metal 3. And so why do I have this higher than Twisted Metal 3? I think the gameplay is actually better. You are still, you know, dropped into these rather large environments and are tasked with destroying everybody else. A lot of these maps are pretty big, and there's a lot to explore and a lot of different weapons to find, and the car combat itself is actually pretty solid. I think it's better than Twisted Metal 3's. It's a bit faster, the physics are a bit better, they're more like 1 and 2's. When you roll over, you don't stay rolled over, you like immediately get back up, and I think that the game has a decent sense of speed. I think the general level design is fine. A lot of these stages don't really stand out all that much. The maze is just freaking horrible though. And I think that when it comes to the car selection, it's actually solid enough here. I like the specials. I mean, I'm not going to say the characters are all that interesting because they're just not, but at least the car selection is decent. The game is a bit harder than the third game. The final boss in particular, like Sweet Tooth, will just absolutely annihilate you. His special is way too good. It's the best one in the whole series, seriously. But all in all, I think that this is an alright experience. It does go for a very different vibe from the first three games. It's certainly a lot more cartoony and over the top, and I mean, I could take it or leave it. The music is pretty good, a lot of Rob Zombie and heavy metal again. I like that. I think the game really is a marginal improvement over 3, but it's not like a major improvement, and I'd still rather play other games in the series. And I'm sure the multiplayer is fun. I've unfortunately never played it. I think fans of the car combat genre should try out Twisted Metal 4, or if you like Twisted Metal. Everyone else though, yeah, you can probably avoid it. Alright, so here's the OG, the one that started it all, Twisted Metal for the PS1, developed by Single Track and released on the PS1 as a launch title in 1995. Now, the original Twisted Metal is a lot of things, but it really is the game that put the car combat genre in the mainstream and allowed it to stay in the mainstream in the 90s. In the 90s, there were tons of car combat games. It was a great time, and Twisted Metal was always one of the best games. And the original game, yeah, it's still pretty fun. It has aged in a number of different ways, especially when compared to its sequels, but I still think that this game does provide a pretty good time. And you know, the premise was pretty simple. Once a year on Christmas in the LA area, a man named Calypso gathers some of the most dangerous people in the whole world to come and destroy each other in their cars. And the winner of the Twisted Metal competition would get a wish of their choosing, no matter how crazy it might be. Now, I really do love this game's story, its vibe, its characters, its endings, the character motivations. It's very, very 90s, I won't lie to you, but I really just have a soft spot for it. I think it's very unique, and it is still well done, even compared to the other Twisted Metal games. I think it's pretty good. Now, a lot of car combat games, especially nowadays, are racing games with car combat elements, or they're more like Carmageddon, where you can race or destroy your opponents. Twisted Metal, though, they said screw that. There's no racing here. There's nothing even close to racing here. You are just dropped into an environment and told to destroy everything. Destroy all your opponents, destroy the environment if you want, just destroy, destroy, destroy. And that is what you'll be doing. You'll be driving around these maps, destroying stuff, finding weapons to then destroy your opponents with. And your AI opponents will be doing the same as well. They really will kick your ass. They will target you. And this game is not messing around. This is a tough game. It leads to some engaging gameplay, however sometimes they really will just annihilate you. That's just how it goes. The actual level design is pretty decent here. It is a lot more basic and flat than a lot of the other games. It's all in LA, so I mean, take it as you will. At least the car selection is pretty decent here, and a lot of the fan favorites really were here from day one. Now, I still think the original Twisted Metal is a fun time, but when you compare it to most of the other games in the series, especially some of the later games, yeah, it kind of doesn't hold up as well. The handling is pretty bad in this game. It's kind of all over the place. It's just incredibly imprecise. The difficulty just gets absolutely ridiculous, and it can feel quite a bit basic compared to the other games thanks to its flat maps and limited weapons. But you also got to cut this game some slack. It was the first Twisted Metal. It was the first car combat game on the PlayStation. It was one of the first PS1 games, period. I mean, come on now. You got to cut it some slack. But the fact remains that this is still a legendary game and a certified classic. And so here's the latest in the Twisted Metal series for now, hopefully, and it's Twisted Metal, released for the PS3 in February of 2012. Now, I remember when this game was announced, I remember when they were developing it, and I remember when it came out, and I remember being crazy excited for it. I love Twisted Metal. I was so ready for a new game with a great online play, and you know, looking back over a decade later now, this game was pretty alright. Now, this game would act as a reboot of the Twisted Metal series, still retaining the same general story and gameplay. They just kind of wanted a fresh start, and I mean, fair enough. Twisted Metal Black had some pretty definitive endings, so Twisted Metal on PS3 still is the same basic premise. Calypso holds the Twisted Metal event, and whoever wins gets a wish of their choosing. Rather than a large cast of characters, you now only have the 4, and each of them have very in-depth motivations, backgrounds, stories, character themselves, and actually a number of cutscenes. I say cutscenes, but these really are cinematics, as I'm pretty sure this is real life, and you know, it's kind of funny how all these years later they still have the real life cinematics for Twisted Metal. The original game had it, and this game has it too, and you know, these are great. These are really dark and edgy and serious, and I think they're actually really well done. They're interesting, they're different, the motivations are good, and the endings are really what you would expect for Twisted Metal. Sure, there's not as many characters as the old games, but I think that it's a lot more fleshed out here, and would I take the old characters over this? Yeah, I probably would rather have more characters than a couple fleshed out characters, but I still do appreciate what they did here, and I actually really do like the story and its cinematics. Unfortunately, due to there being less characters to play through the story mode with, there's less replayability. Again, I really like the story mode and the cinematics. It's just there's less replayability. I remember when this game came out, I pretty much sat down that weekend and finished like the entire game in maybe a day and a half. No, the main focus of Twisted Metal on PS3 was the online multiplayer, which unfortunately has been discontinued as of 2019. However, I remember trying to play a bunch of multiplayer back when the game came out, and I remember the multiplayer was very hit and miss. I remember there was a lot of issues with the servers and the lobbies and games just not starting. I remember this game had the weirdest issues. It would be like you would sit in a full lobby for 10-15 minutes and the game would not start for some reason. I don't know if anybody else remembers how many multiplayer issues there were with this game, especially around launch, but if you remember, let me know in the comments, because I remember just being very frustrated with the online, because I really wanted to play a bunch of this game online, and I just wasn't able to because of all these weird server issues and connectivity issues and games just not starting, and it's a really big shame because the car combat gameplay in this game is actually fantastic. It is really well done. I thought it was some of the best car combat gameplay legit ever. It is the most modern car combat game probably around. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's other Destruction Derby games that have come out since, like Wreckfest, but in terms of an actual car combat, projectile-based Destruction Derby-esque game, there really hasn't been much since Twisted Metal, and I don't think any of them been anywhere near as good as this game was. Like, the car combat gameplay was really well done. There were so many different options you could take. These maps were huge and sprawling and full of different opponents that you could fight, and it went up to a ton of different players. There was just so much going on in these games. It was so much fun. There were tons of different vehicles. While there wasn't a ton of characters, there was still tons of different vehicles. You could even fly around in a helicopter. There's a bunch of weapons. And then these maps were, again, incredibly varied. They had a lot of depth. I thought the controls were actually really good. They might be some of the best controls of the series. There was actually other game modes besides just the regular Destruction Derby-esque game mode where you kill each other. The presentation was just fantastic for the time, not just the cinematics, and I thought the soundtrack was great too with all of its licensed music. When it came down to the gameplay of Twisted Metal, it was so good. It was so much fun. It's just a real shame that, unfortunately, the multiplayer wasn't amazing thanks to those issues, and now the multiplayer is gone. So we have a pretty decent single player you can still play, and of course there's always going to be the fun local multiplayer, but the game certainly feels lacking in today's age compared to the other games, thanks to, again, an over-reliance on online multiplayer. The game ultimately feels crippled. Should you play it nowadays? Of course. If you like car combat games, this is a no-brainer. Just know that you're not really going to get the full experience these days because, again, the online multiplayer is down. But this totally shows that Twisted Metal would absolutely work in the modern day if they could get the online multiplayer to work correctly. And I really hope that we get a new modern Twisted Metal that really builds on this game because the core gameplay of this game was just so good. I was so excited for this game when it came out, and you know, all these years later, I'm still pretty happy with it. It probably could have been a lot better if the multiplayer had been hampered out and just play tested more, but it is what it is. It's still a pretty fun game. And so here's another certified classic. Here we have Twisted Metal 2, released on the PS1 in 1996. Now, Twisted Metal 2 really does what every sequel should do. They look at that original game, they look at some of the flaws, they look at what worked, what didn't, and just made an overall better game. And you know, Twisted Metal 2, oh, this is a really fun game, and it is quite a bit better than Twisted Metal 1. The premise really is the same, just on a grander scale. LA's been completely destroyed from the first Twisted Metal. A year goes by, Calypso's holding another Twisted Metal. This time it's worldwide though, and whoever wins gets a wish of their choice. I actually really do like the story. I think the cutscenes are great, the characters are great, the motivation and the endings are all really well done. I like how everything looks. It's definitely got that dark humor feel, and it's not as dark as the first game. It's a lot more comic book feely, but I actually think it's really good. It might be the best in terms of its atmosphere and vibes in the whole series. Like, there's a reason a lot of people really regard Twisted Metal 2 as the best in terms of its characters and stories. It's actually really well done. It's one of my favorite aspects of the game. And when you're playing the game, it definitely feels like Twisted Metal 1, but just elevated in a number of different ways. They really looked at some of the more shallow elements of the original game and were able to improve on it. First off, the handling is quite a bit better. It's not as imprecise as before. It's still not amazing, but it's fine enough. The vehicle selection is one of the best in the entire series. There's a ton of fan favorites here that were introduced. A bunch of the old characters return. Like, the vehicle selection, nothing but good stuff to say, and I do really like the characters. My favorite newcomer is definitely Axel. Axel's pretty great. He's one of the best in the whole series. Now, when it comes to the level design, it is a lot more expansive than the original game. The original game was just LA, and it was pretty flat for the most part. This is all over the world. You go to a ton of different locations, and they all look very different from each other. They also play pretty different. There's actually some stuff to explore here. In the first game, there wasn't really all that much to explore and see. Here, there actually is some nooks and crannies where you can find some really good weapons to use on your opponents. And when it comes to the car combat itself, it's just as satisfying as it was in the original game. You get a bunch of different weapons that you find all over the map to use on your opponents. They can just totally wreck your shit again. This game is not messing around. This game's actually probably harder than the original game. It is not an easy game by any means, but the car combat is engaging. It's fun. Blowing other people up is great. It's incredibly satisfying. The vehicles have weight. The game has a decent sense of speed. And again, exploring the maps is actually fun. I think the gameplay is some of the best car combat gameplay of the 90s. And like the first game, you go through a tournament mode just trying to survive and destroy everyone and fighting some bosses along the way. The bosses will absolutely just annihilate you, especially the final boss. It is, again, not an easy game. And the game is multiplayer. This game has probably one of, if not the best multiplayer of any PS1 game. Seriously, like when it comes to PS1 games in multiplayer, Twisted Metal is always going to be near the top, particularly Twisted Metal 2. When it comes to PS1 car combat games, I really do think Twisted Metal 2 is at the top thanks to its good roster, good level design, and just all around an incredibly fun experience. I think that this game should not be missed by anybody who likes car combat games, really driving games, and yeah, the game does look dated and it plays a bit dated compared to some of the later Twisted Metal games, but it's still incredibly fun, and I think it's still a good time. Well, we're getting near the top here, and here we have the underrated Twisted Metal Head-On, specifically the Extra Twisted Edition on the PS2, coming out originally for the PSP as a launch title in 2005, and then the PS2 in 2008. Now, I never played the PSP game. I remember getting the PS2 version back when I was in like middle school and just absolutely falling in love with it and just locking myself in my room that weekend and watching George Lopez and playing this game because I was really into it. And all these years later, Twisted Metal Head-On Extra Twisted Edition, I think this is one of the best car combat games like ever and one of the best Twisted Metal games. It really is the real Twisted Metal 3. It takes place after Twisted Metal 2. It ignores Twisted Metal 3, 4, and even Black. It sees Calypso running the tournament again, and whoever wins gets the wish. I think this game is some of the best stories of the entire series. It really does capture that kind of magic almost that was Twisted Metal 2. It captures a very similar art style as well. I really do like the cinematics in this game, and I really, again, just like the characters. I like the stories, the motivation, and I think the ending is a lot more in line with the endings of the old games. It's familiar, but it's also new at the same time. It's nowhere near as dark as Twisted Metal Black or the PS3 game either. Again, it is much more in line with Twisted Metal 2, and I just really like it. Now, when it comes to the character roster, I think it is very solid. It's one of the strongest rosters that the series has ever seen. It's got like all the fan favorites. However, the only new characters in the game are bosses, so take that as you will. But when it comes to the actual car combat gameplay, I think it is pretty superb. It really does build on Twisted Metal 2 in particular. The cars have really good handling. I think it is some of the best handling the series has ever seen. They have some good weight, good sense of speed, and you drive around these environments that are decently well designed, I might add, and just try to destroy your opponents. I think it's a really simple yet addictive gameplay loop, and it really just builds, again, on top of the second game. All the maps are really fleshed out. There's a lot of different little secrets and nooks and crannies to them. There's a ton of weapons hidden all over. They all look incredibly different. They're all very different to play on. The AI isn't stupidly difficult like the first and second game. I would say that this game probably is the best AI in like the whole series. It's the most balanced as well. It's a challenge, but it's not too challenging. And then, to go back to the secrets for a second, there's even secret areas you can find in these levels where you're able to partake in these fun little mini games. This is how you get some of the unlockables, but I was just like, wow, there's actually like secret little mini games, and the game does actually reward your exploration while you're of course trying to destroy all your opponents. Now, while I know the car combat subgenre isn't exactly thriving or all that big, I really do think that this game is near the very top, if not like at the top of the mountain. It is actually just an incredibly fun time. It's very fun with friends. It's good by yourself. It has some really deep but rewarding gameplay, and I think that it just is expertly designed for the most part. The developers just knew what we really wanted to see as Twisted Metal fans. The Twisted Metal fan base is a really hardcore and passionate fan base, especially nowadays, and this game really just catered hard to them, and you know, as a hardcore fan, I thought it was great. Now, the PS2 version, the Extra Twisted Edition, even throws in a bunch of bonuses for those hardcore fans, like a bunch of behind the scenes. They let you play like a beta of a canceled Twisted Metal game. They let you run around as Sweet Tooth on foot and listen to tidbits and developer notes. And then there's even all the concept art. They actually do of the original real-life cutscene cinematics from the original game. You can view them here, which is pretty great. And if you love Twisted Metal, this game is an absolute no-brainer. This is like a must-play. If you like car combat games, this is a must-play, and I just wholeheartedly recommend it. Call me basic, but I really do think the best of the Twisted Metal games, and maybe the best vehicular combat game of all time, is Twisted Metal Black. Developed by the newly formed Incognito Entertainment, it was a reboot of the Twisted Metal series, and it was much darker than anything that had ever come before. Now, don't get me wrong, the original couple games had some dark moments. They were pretty edgy and sometimes were relatively sinister, but nothing was as edgy or dark compared to Twisted Metal Black. This game is very dark. It has a much more mature theme, and it might be the most sinister out of all the Twisted Metal games, including the PS3 game. And out of all the games, I think this game has the most foreboding and engrossing atmosphere and just general vibes that it puts off. It's my favorite atmosphere and story of the whole series. The character roster is very good, as well as a lot of them are returning. There's a few new ones here, but like all the fan favorites are here, and now they're all super edgy and dark and have these really tragic, sad, just kind of evil backstories, and they all want to win Twisted Metal for their own reason. I love how all the characters are locked up in an insane asylum, and they're all coming out to just go kill each other in Twisted Metal. I think the story, the characters, the atmosphere, all of that is just fantastic. I think it's actually really well done, and it's probably the best of the whole series, tied with either Head On or 2, but I really do just love this game when it comes to, again, that atmosphere. It's just not a lot of games can capture the kind of dark, gritty atmosphere that this game does, and then that main song, I Want to Paint It Black by Rolling Stones, oh, it just really fits. It's just perfect for this game. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, I think it's just really the pinnacle of the series. It takes basically everything from all the Twisted Metal games that had come out before it and kind of puts it all together to create this just superb car combat experience where it's not even all that different from the other games. You go through a tournament mode, you're dropped into a map, sometimes big, sometimes small, and you're tasked with just destroying everything, killing all your opponents in the most gruesome way possible. You drive around the map, you find weapons, and then you blow each other up. You get some special weapon depending on the vehicle you choose, and there's a turbo, there's machine guns, and you just have at it. There's no racing, there's no gimmicks, you just go after each other. I think the handling is probably the best in the whole series. The cars really do have some weight, especially depending on who you choose. All of the cars feel different from each other, which is pretty great. And I think generally the handling, it's not imprecise or stiff. It actually does feel good. The game does have a sense of speed if you actually try to go quickly, and it's relatively fast paced. It's also as hard as a cement wall. Seriously, this game is not messing around. This is maybe the hardest in the whole series. Twisted Metal Black has no problem just absolutely wiping the floor with you, where you can get annihilated seriously in like 45 seconds if you're not careful by these AI. Like, it doesn't matter what difficulty you're on, this game will destroy you. I remember when I was younger just spending seriously like 30 minutes to an hour on each level because I just kept dying until I actually eventually did get hella raw. This game will make you get raw. You have to get good to continue through this game. You have to know the maps like the back of your hand. You got to know where the weapons are. You got to know when to destroy people, and some luck's always going to be in there as well. This game is simple to pick up and just play and have some fun with, but if you want to actually get somewhere in the championship mode, you're going to need to get really good. You're going to need to master this game's maps and handling and vehicles in general. The game's maps are great though. These are some of the best maps the series has ever seen. There's a lot of depth to them. There's hidden areas. There's stuff to see and explore, and I actually really genuinely do like the maps in this game. I think they're all great. They're all really memorable. And then this game's presentation is just so different from the other games. Like, it is really bleak, especially on these maps. It is dark as shit, just tonally, visually, like, it's dark. The game still looks very good, sound is very good, and I did really enjoy the presentation still. It's just like, wow, this is a dark game. Still, the game was an incredibly fun time that I have just a ton of memories with. Out of all the Twisted Metal games, I probably have the most memories with this one. I've played a bunch of the multiplayer as well. Multiplayer is very fun in this game. It actually did go online. It was a separate game technically, but it did go online for the PS2. Unfortunately, I never got to play that. I wish I did, because I bet it was fun, and it was probably better than the PS3 games multiplayer. But this game is without a doubt one of my very favorite PS2 games. It's probably in my top 5. I just really love it. It's my favorite car combat game of all time. I don't think that the series or really the genre ever got better than this game. It was just so unique and well done. And I really do think that even with such a hardcore fan base, if you ask people what their favorite Twisted Metal game is, I think most of them are probably going to say Twisted Metal Black, because this game is just really that much fun, and I think it really just has a lot going for it. If you have not tried this game at some point for whatever reason, I really think you should change that. I really think this game is worth playing for anybody who likes driving games, anybody who likes car combat games, and if you haven't played Twisted Metal and you're vaguely interested in Twisted Metal, you should really try this one. I don't know if I'd start with this game because it is so hard, but I mean, if you start with this game, all the other games are going to be easy by comparison. But really, that's it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Let me know your favorite Twisted Metal down below. I had a lot of fun making this video because I am such a big fan of the series. I really genuinely hope we get another Twisted Metal. Please, why are they making some TV show? Why are they making a TV show? Like, I work for Sony and I still don't get it. Either way, I'm crossing my fingers we do get another one. And yeah, that's it. Hope everyone has a great day, evening, night, whatever. Stay safe, everyone. See ya.